In the last video, I talked about the first and second lines of defense of the immune system. And in this lecture, I'll talk about the third line of defense. So once the bacteria or viruses get past the first and second lines of defense, then they're faced with a stronger third line of defense, the adaptive immune response. The adaptive immune response involves white blood cells called lymphocytes, lymphocytes referred to as T cells and B cells. So we have T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. And as we learned in the one of the previous lectures, when we learned about the lymphatic system, we learned that T cells and B cells are produced in the bone marrow, and T cells or T lymphocytes are named such because they migrate to the thymus, and that is where they mature, and the B cells mature in the bone marrow. So there's the cell-mediated response pathway of the adaptive immune response, and also this humoral response pathway of the adaptive immune response. So both of these cell-mediated and humoral response are both part of the adaptive immune response. And we'll see how the white blood cells, the lymphocytes, the role that they play in the cell-mediated response, and the role that some other types of white blood cells play in the humoral response. The learning outcomes for the adaptive immune defenses are to explain the role of antigen in the adaptive immune defenses, also to summarize the process of antibody-mediated immunity, as well as summarize the process of cell-mediated immunity. And so we'll learn about these sort of separately but together. The antibody-mediated immunity as well as the cell-mediated immunity work together in the entire adaptive immune response. So the adaptive immune defenses function to provide some protection against cancer. Cells at any point in time can become cancerous, but it's the job of the adaptive immune response to eliminate those cancerous cells before they start dividing and out of control into tumors. So in the early, very early stages, our body protects us from cancerous cells. The immune system can distinguish self from foreign, and so this is a major role of the immune system, to be able to tell what is foreign or what is harmful between that which is our own cells or which is self. And so the ability to distinguish between the two is very important, because we don't want our immune cells to kill off our own healthy cells. The immune system also responds to antigens, and antigens are things that the immune system is going to recognize as foreign, things that are not self, things that are not our own cells. Our body will recognize them as foreign. And so you can imagine if there's a problem with the immune system being able to distinguish self from non-self or self from foreign, and there's disorders where the immune system starts to destroy your own body's cells, and these are autoimmune diseases, those which kill off our own cells. And so getting back to the ability of the adaptive immune system to respond to antigens. Antigens are anything that is going to create an immune response. It can be fragments of bacteria. can be viruses, molds, parasitic worms. All of these different types of organisms and substances can be antigenic, meaning can trigger an immune response. The adaptive defenses work by coordinating the cell-mediated immune system with the humoral-mediated immune system. And these defenses, these adaptive defenses, are going to depend on the action of the B lymphocytes or B cells, as well as the T lymphocytes or T cells. B cells and T cells have specific antigen receptors on the surface of their cells. And so these proteins that are on the surface of these cells can bind to specific antigens. And once they bind to specific antigens, then they go through this phase of maturity, of maturing, either in the bone marrow for the B cells or the thymus for the T cells. And so they go through this process where at first when they recognize that antigen, then those receptors become more and more specific for that particular antigen that they encountered. And so the cells develop a memory for that antigen so that next time they encounter that antigen, the action that takes place to eliminate that antigen is faster and stronger. And so sometimes your body that you can't even tell that you've encountered an antigen because your immune system has acquired a memory for some specific pathogen and it eliminates it before it can cause any problems. And so the specific antigen receptor on the outside of the cell surface and how it binds to that specific antigen is like a lock and a key. They fit together perfectly and they're very specific. There are two pathways of adaptive immunity, as I mentioned, the cell-mediated and the antibody-mediated. The cell-mediated immunity involves the T cells that kill cells that contain a specific foreign antigen. And so these types of cells are our own self cells that usually are infected with viruses. And so we know viruses are going to infect host cells, and the T cells work to kill those types of cells that have a specific antigen inside of them. The antibody-mediated immunity, also called humoral immunity, is where the big players of the antibody-mediated immunity are the B cells or the B lymphocytes. The B cells produce antibodies that bind to free antigens in the body fluids. And so if you have some bacteria that are floating around in your bloodstream, the B cells are going to produce these antibodies, release them into circulation, and so the antibodies are going to attach to these bacteria or attach to these pathogens so that the other white blood cells in the body can find them and phagocytize them and kill them. And so the antibodies kind of act like little flags that are going to stick onto the bacteria or the pathogens that are in the circulation or in the tissues so that the white blood cells can find them based on the flags. So again, the T cells are going to destroy antigens that are contained inside of cells, and then antibody-mediated immunity or humoral immunity, the B cells are going to produce antibodies or those little flags or tags that are going to bind to the antigens that are in body fluids and tag them so that other white blood cells can come and attack them and rid them from the body. So this is an overview of the adaptive immune defenses. In this first row, you can see the adaptive immunity and how it's split into the cell-mediated immunity. That's going to eliminate antigens that are found within cells, like virus-infected cells, and the antibody-mediated immunity, or the humoral immunity, where this pathway is going to rid the body of antigens that are outside of cells, and these are mostly like bacterial pathogens. On the second row, you can see the pathway of the cell-mediated immunity. There are a type of cell called a cytotoxic T cell that is really involved in phagocytizing or puncturing infected cells. So in response to cells that are infected with viruses, these T cytotoxic cells will phagocytize or destroy those infected cells. After they have encountered an antigen, they will produce T cells that have a memory. So those cells that have encountered the antigen, they will produce memory cells and go through that maturation process in the thymus. These cytotoxic T cells are activated by a type of T cell called a helper T cell. These helper T cells are going to activate both the cytotoxic T cells, and they're also going to activate the adaptive immune pathway, the antibody-mediated immunity. So this helper T cell kind of orchestrates both the cell-mediated immunity as well as the antibody-mediated immunity. And so when the cytotoxic T cell encounters antigen, or when that helper cell encounters antigen, it will trigger a response from the cytotoxic T cells, and it will also trigger sending cytokines or messages to the antibody-mediated immune response pathway to turn on this pathway and stimulate these B cells. And so what happens is, whatever antigen is encountered here, it will send signals to the antibody-mediated immune system, and it will trigger the B cells to make antibodies. These B cells now are going to make antibodies against the antigen that was encountered by the helper T cell. That B cell makes antibodies, which are these Y-shaped molecules. And these antibodies will stick or bind to the bacterial cell, or that foreign antigen. They will stick onto that foreign antigen, and then white blood cells will come along, detect those antibodies, and phagocytize that bacteria. And so after this B cell encounters an antigen that's been triggered by the helper T cell, then that B cell will also be involved in making memory cells or maturing in the bone marrow, of course, because it's the B cell. And so whichever pathway is taken, both of these are going to work together. One pathway may be triggered before the other depending on the type of pathogen or antigen that's present in the body, but eventually both of these pathways are going to be triggered in order to seek out and destroy that foreign invader. And so once you have both of these pathways working, both of these pathways are going to lead to the production of memory T cells as well as memory B cells. So after the infection is over, those memory T cells and memory B cells hang around in the circulation. And so when the body encounters that same specific antigen again, the immune response is much faster than it is the first time it's recognized. And so um, because those memory cells are in the body already, and they don't have to go through that maturation process, the response is quicker and stronger. So of course, whenever you have normal processes, there are always some abnormal things that can happen and that can go wrong. Tissue rejection is one of those things that can go wrong with the immune system. In the case of donors and recipients, we all have something called MHC proteins on the outside of our cells. These MHC proteins, MHC stands for major histocompatibility proteins, on the outside of our cells. These proteins, when matching donors and recipients of tissue transplants, blood donation, organ donation, these MHC proteins should be as closely matched as possible between the donor and recipient so that something called tissue rejection doesn't occur. The rejection of transplanted tissue, when transplanted tissue is recognized as foreign once the recipient receives it, what happens is the cytotoxic T cells will attack that transplanted tissue because it's recognizing it as some foreign cells. This tissue rejection can be controlled by immunosuppressive drugs and by transplanting organs, of course, that have very similar or the same MHC proteins on the donor and recipients, which is why when people need transplants, they look to closely related relatives first before they look to non-family members or friends, because the MHC proteins on closely related people are more similar than people who are not related. Another disorder is the severe combined immunodeficiency disease, where both the antibody and the cell-mediated immunity pathways of the adaptive immune response are either inadequate or completely lacking. In this case, even a minor infection can be fatal because these people do not have a functioning they don't have functioning T cells or they don't have functioning B cells to fight off infections. This disorder, SCID, can be treated with bone marrow transplant or also with gene therapy. Acquired immune deficiencies can be caused by infections, infections with viruses, chemical exposure, or even radiation. Something that we're all familiar with is acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS, which results from an infection with the human immunodeficiency virus. These patients are more susceptible to infections and have a higher risk of cancer because their immune response is severely deficient. They don't have a properly functioning adaptive immune response. Just very similar to the SCIDS patients, but they have an immune response, but it is quite lower than normal. And so what HIV does is it infects those T cells, so it targets those T lymphocytes and weakens the immune system. And so patients with AIDS are more susceptible to infections and also have that higher risk of cancer because of that. Another autoimmune disease is rheumatoid arthritis. Rheumatoid arthritis is when our bodies make antibodies that attack our joints. And it's the cytotoxic T cells or the antibodies that are recognizing our body's own cells as foreign. And so people with rheumatoid arthritis have these abnormalities in their joints. So at this point, I would like for you to check your progress by detailing how the innate immune response or the innate defense, the first and second line of defense, how they differ from the third line of defense or the adaptive immune response. Also, distinguish between those cells that are involved in targeting an antigen that is contained within a cell versus the antigens that are just free in the interstitial fluid. Which pathway of the adaptive immune response targets these antigens that are contained within our body cells, and which pathway targets these antigens that are free in the interstitial fluid. So I'd like for you to write down the questions or the answers in your notes, and we will discuss them on Thursday in class.